The evening moon cast its eerie glow upon the world, and some of the residents with common sense knew it was unwise to stay out late on a night like this. It wasn't always like this. In fact, it had only been a few months ago that the strange wraiths had started appearing in the night, with the coming of winter's early arrival. None knew from where the wraiths came, and none had even laid eyes on them, but all knew what they heard in the night, and what they felt in their bones. It was the middle of September, when, strangely, the leaves were already starting to fall, and the grass was beginning to feel the chill of frost in the mornings. The snow had yet to arrive, but there were the telltale signs of winter's approach. But why so soon? Should it not wait another month or so? What brought winter so soon to this little town of Creighton? No one knew. But that night, as the winds howled and the chill set, there came the sound of unearthly screams, the cries of children and the weeping of women, a snarling sound like wolves on the hunt, and finally a pale, haunting laughter. Few dared to look out their windows or open their doors to see what had happened or why, but when the sounds finally faded and the peace returned, the Millers were nowhere to be found, their home torn to pieces and bloody splashes on furniture and walls as if hacked up by an axe. Every week or so the same would happen, and people became afraid to venture outside too long, even during the day. As night set into town, the tavern was packed with figures. Some out-of-towners who had no idea what the nights brought here, and some who knew all too well about the wraiths and were there for their own safety. As the soft piano music played in the tavern, the doors opened, and in walked a man that drew the eye of more than a few. He was not native to this town, and yet many patrons knew his face. He was of average height, with a moderate build. He wore a black hat upon his head, and he had on dark gloves. A cold wind was blowing into the town with a chill that sent most of the passerby into the nearby inn and tavern for warmth, to hide his hands. A leather coat adorned his shoulders and fell down to his calves like a cape, and his tan-stitched pants were loose over his riding boots, which clomped musically as he walked to the bar, sitting down at a table in the corner, not even bothering to flag down a barmaid or barkeep. The folks in the tavern tried not to glare. The ones who didn't know who he was weren't sure why he bothered the other patrons, but the ones who knew? They had every reason to detest the man in the corner pulling a cigarette and lighting it near his lips. After a few minutes passed, another figure approached. A spindly man with bandana tied around his neck and a blue coat over a button-down collared work shirt. A belt of pistol ammo was wrapped around his waist, and his own boots were thin and not nearly as musical, sounding like the clacking of steel on wood with each step. He, too, dropped down in the seat across from the stranger and smirked. "Got a light?" he asked. The stranger glanced at him and shrugged, passing him a match. The newcomer took the match gratefully and struck it, lighting his own smoke. He took a long puff of the stick and then exhaled the smoke into the ceiling, laughing to himself. "Damn, not bad stuff they sell in this town. Been here long?" "Who wants to know?" the stranger asked. "Name's Victor," the smirking newcomer answered. "And no need to ask your name." "Jake Brewer." The name was hissed softly from Victor's teeth, but it had the effect he knew it would. The piano music lulled suddenly, as if the pianist had stumbled over the next note. A few patrons rose to their feet in surprise and in anger at the name, and the reaction only brought Victor a greater smile. Jake's hand shifted to his holster. "I don't want any trouble, stranger," Jake replied. "Neither do I. Frankly, your name don't mean spit to me," Victor chuckled, "but you're like me. You and I are in the same line of work, and if you're here for my score, then I'm afraid we might just have an issue." "You don't know the first thing about my work," Jake muttered darkly through his cigarette. "You hunt men, Mr. Brewer," Victor shrugged. "Come on, it ain't no secret. You've brought in some nice-sized bounties, too. The Adeline gang, Bobby Russell, Black Hand Pete. You don't got to be ashamed of it. In fact, I somewhat admire you. It takes a special kind of dirtbag to turn over his fellow man for money. My kind of dirtbag, to be specific." "You talk a lot, friend," Jake answered through his cigarette, not looking directly at the annoying bounty hunter across from him. "And you can admire me or hate me like everyone else here. I really don't care. I'm not here for your bounty, so if that's what you're worried about, you can leave me in peace. I'm not here on a job." Victor exhaled slightly and shrugged, taking another breath of smoke. Is that right?" he asked. "Damn, almost a shame, I'd say. Would have liked to have put my wits up against yours, but ain't no trouble either. Small prize anyway, ain't worth a gunfight. His eyes glanced back towards the crowded tables where two barmaids were walking around delivering drinks and trying to avoid pinches and squeezes from drunk patrons. He grinned and then looked back at Jake with a smirk. So, if you ain't here for the bounty, what's the rustler like you doing in this town? Chasing the lead, Jake answered. The early winter? The wraiths people whisper about? That's what I'm interested in. Jake now turned his cold blue eyes on Victor directly, and for a moment, Victor felt a death-like intensity from them. This was a man who'd killed more than a few times. Would you know anything about that? You kidding? Victor laughed. Hell, I only just got here myself. Ain't worried about ghost stories or the worries this town's got. Once I get that little chink over there, I'll be heading out myself. He indicated the young barmaid who was fumbling over herself carrying a tray of mugs, each dirty from use, but empty and clattering against each other. She looked like a fish had stood up and learned to walk and had no idea where it was, bumping into everything, squealing with fear at the nearest man who pinched her butt playfully. The girl, Jake asked. She's your bounty? Oh, come on. Don't tell me you don't recognize her, Victor laughed. That's Madam Lee, the wife of and collaborator with that bank robber June Lee. They've hit at least 3 banks since coming northward. Surely you know about them. Jake stared at Victor a long time before he took out his cigarette and motioned towards the door. You might want to go somewhere else, friend. That ain't your Madam Lee, he grumbled. What? Madam Lee and June Lee are both in their 40s, and that girl couldn't be older than maybe 28, maybe 30 if you wanted to push it. Plus, the Lees have been in the States long enough to know how this part of the world works. And that girl looks fresh off the boat. She ain't your prize, Jake replied. Do yourself a favor. You know the sheriff don't like hunters bringing in false bounties just to collect reward money. Victor's smile faded some as doubt started to settle. I thought you didn't want any trouble, Brewer. I don't. Then mind your own business, he snapped. You said yourself you weren't interested in this bounty, so leave her to me. Sure, okay, she looks a bit young, but all them chicks look alike to me anyway. He sighed and stood up, adjusting the gun on his belt and tipping his hat with his free hand. Been real nice chatting with you, Mr. Brewer. Jake half wanted to get up and stop him, tell him to stop this and leave the barmaid alone, but he stayed put and shrugged his shoulders. It wasn't his business. He was only in town to wait and see if the wraiths showed up. One less loudmouth bounty hunter wannabe making noise and disturbing him, the better. Let him grab the girl and go. It wouldn't matter. Nothing could have mattered less. He leaned forward, waiting for one of the other barmaids to notice him and approach with something to drink. And then he heard the first scream. His heart stopped a moment at the sound, thinking it might be the arrival of the wraiths at last. But no. The scream was inside the tavern. The patrons all looked to see the bounty hunter Victor, his hand pressing the Asian girl against the wall of the tavern as his other hand worked rope around her wrist behind her back to hog-tie her. Stop struggling, you useless bitch, Victor snarled. The girl was screaming in a language that no one understood. Jake listened close, but couldn't make anything out of the strangeness. Though it didn't quite sound Chinese to him, he'd heard a few Chinamen talk in the past, but it didn't sound like this. Her English was very poor, but understandable enough for everyone to understand that she was professing her innocence. Damn, you're a wriggly one, aren't you? Victor snapped, slapping her across the face as he yanked her onto his shoulder, leaving her to kick her legs frantically. No, yeah, please to help me. No one moved. Her heart was beating faster, and her desperation getting worse as Victor carried her to the door. Would you shut up already? He growled. But the girl wasn't done. Yokai wa doku desu ka? Yokai! Demon! Praise the demons! Now Jake was on his feet, stepping out from behind the table. I think I've heard enough, he announced, stepping forward. Victor paused and glared at Jake angrily. I told you to mind your own business, Brewer. The girl isn't who you're looking for, and her screaming is bothering everyone in the tavern. Well, don't you worry. She won't be in here much longer. Now step out of... Victor stopped talking as he watched Jake pull a 6-shooter from his holster and level it right at Victor's face. The cold death was back in his eyes. I'm not going to ask you again, friend, Jake hissed. Now put her down. Every chair in the tavern was moving back. The music had stopped, and men were stepping away from the two gunslingers. Some were going for their own guns, while others were trying to sneak out the back to get the sheriff. The only sound that could be heard were the sobs of the girl, still being held by her captor. Victor sneered and dropped the girl on the floor with a thud, and his hand hovered carefully above his own holster. You sure this is the choice you want to make, Brewer? He asked. She's some chink bitch with a bounty and you're gonna kill me for her? Whether or not I kill you depends very much on your next course of action, friend. You can walk out that door now and go your own way, or you can be carried out to the Undertaker. Personally, I don't care which. Not once did the gun lower or waver. He was dead serious and Victor could see it. His hand quivered. What? All for some little bitch? I'm done talking. Make your choice, friend. Jake cocked back the hammer of his gun, and the leg could be heard clinking into place, ready to deliver. The two stared each other down, neither blinking, neither moving. Go to hell, you and your damned old man! Whether or not Victor was prepared to walk away or fight was never known, because there was the last words he would ever speak. The explosion of a single round sent the whole room screaming as Victor's head rocked back, and then he fell, sprawled on the ground, blood oozing from just above his left eye. Jake lowered the gun and holstered it before turning to the body and sneering. Poor choice. Jake marched to the girl and looked her over. She had her eyes closed, trembling like a leaf. He reached down and picked her up, pulling a Bowie knife from his pocket and cutting the cords around her wrists. The people watched in stunned silence, none moving, none daring to argue or speak. Jake simply went about his work as the girl sobbed and whimpered like a child who had fallen and scraped herself. Hey! The tavern owner shouted at last. Jake's eyes fell on him, and the owner quickly regretted calling attention to himself as he went pale for a moment. However, all eyes were on him now, so best to finish his thought. You better be able to pay for this. I don't like killing in my place. Jake stared at him a moment. He then reached into his back pocket, pulled out a wad of green bills and threw them at the owner, who squealed louder than his own barmaids as the roll of bills struck the side of the bar with a soft thunk of paper on wood. Sorry for the mess, Jake called. If that doesn't cover the cost, then you can rest assured I won't be back. He helped the girl to her feet, and the bar owner didn't even bother moving towards the money he'd been given. Can you walk? Jake asked. The girl stared at him a moment in silence, and he hissed in frustration, dragging her along. Just come on. The two marched out of the tavern, and he walked to a tall horse tied to a post by the tavern. He stopped by the beast, which snorted constantly upon seeing him. Ever been on horseback? He asked.
Sorry. Wakarimasen, not speaking English good yet.
Damn, of course you don't. Fine. He then grabbed her waist and heaved her onto the horse, as she let out a short squeal of surprise. Jake untied the horse's reins, and the large animal gave him a look of slight annoyance, not happy with the new passenger. Jake shrugged it off and climbed onto the saddle behind the girl so that he could wrap his arms around her for security. Don't fall off. This'll be bumpy. He didn't know or care if she understood him. He'd said what he wanted. He started to turn the horse to ride off. Brewer! Jake cursed under his breath and turned his horse to see a short man on a chestnut mare riding up to him with two men on black horses behind him. The short man had a white beard and balding head, but a big gold star on his chest. The sheriff. Damn it, Brewer, why you coming into quiet towns like this and causing me trouble, boy? Trust me, Richard, not doing it to slight you, Jake replied. You could have fooled me, son, you could have fooled me. So what's the poor fool done this time? Call your old man a snake? Brand you a traitor? Jake didn't answer, but merely looked at the scared girl in front of him, and the sheriff finally took notice. Who in the name of... He was beating a woman, and as a right proper gentleman, I couldn't ignore it. Jake answered in a mock courtesy. The sheriff let out a snort of laughter at the joke. Oh, hell, Jake. Ain't been no gentleman in these hills in well over a decade. Least of all scumbags like you or I. He shook his head, but the sheriff frowned again at the feeling of the cold wind. It's dangerous at night round here, son. I know that. And you causing a ruckus, regardless of the reasons, ain't gonna make no one feel safer. The sheriff snapped. This ain't what your old man wanted for you, Jake. There are a lot of things he didn't want. Jake hissed dangerously, and the sheriff stiffened a bit, knowing he'd touched a nerve he shouldn't have. Look, son, I ain't gonna keep covering for you. I can't do it. I'm sure the poor fool deserved it, and they always do. But one day someone's gonna put a price on your head, and as sheriff, I can't ignore that. I don't want to be your enemy, Jake. Damn it, that's the last thing I want. Jake didn't respond to that, but just watched as the sheriff looked at him. The wind howled softly again, and the girl winced, but the sheriff shook his head. You get that girl out of here and somewhere safe, you hear me? That I'll do, Ricky. Jake turned his horse to ride off. And Jake, I want to see your gentleman ass in this town again, he called back with a laugh before galloping off with his own posse behind him. Jake smiled and shook his head in exhaustion as he turned and started to trot away from the sleepy but frightened town of Clayton. No wraiths had come that night, but one rider left, and not quite empty-handed. Got a name? Jake asked. It was clear the girl was uncomfortable on the horse. She kept grabbing the horse's mane to steady herself, jerking its hair, which made the animal snort angrily at her. She'd have to learn to ride eventually, but that could wait.
Yumiko. Everyone say I'm Yumi, she answered.
Are you from China, Yumi? Jake asked curiously, trying to keep casual conversation going. Getting Yumi to cooperate would only work if she felt she could trust him. Unfortunately, she'd had the displeasure of observing him gun down a man in cold blood. Regardless of context, that will always lead people to an uncomfortable conclusion. Best to start small.
No, not China, no. I'm from Nippon, Japan.
Japan? Jake looked a bit taken aback. He'd heard a good deal about the Japanese islands, but all of it had been from second-hand hearsay. No way of knowing what was true and what wasn't. He'd never met someone from there. He'd heard the country was a bit reclusive. Why are you here? What were you doing serving drinks?
She
paused and looked very uncomfortable, like she was struggling to understand him.
Please say again? Not understanding, so sorry.
Why are you here? Jake growled impatiently. Why leave Japan?
Oh, yes, find brother,
she answered. Glad she now understood the question. Jake looked at her carefully. Back at the tavern, you... No, wait. He paused, realizing he was about to start talking fast again. How best to ask this, he thought.
So sorry? She asked.
Demons. He spoke clearly and carefully. Back there, you said demons. What do you know about demons? Yumi's pleased expression faded like mist, and her eyes became downcast as she focused back on the path ahead, looking further and further away from the town.
Only word in English I know that mean yokai.
Yokai?
It hard to explain, she whispered. Yokai have no... Demon have taken brother.
Jake stared at the back of her head as she said that final statement. Her face hardened some, and he began to finally understand. She didn't have to tell him the details of how she was here or where she was going. Whatever these yokai things were, one had her brother, or at least her brother had to do with one. Could it be like the wraiths he was hunting? Jake couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. This girl wouldn't make it in the West as she was. Look, we're heading to camp. I have some friends who may be able to help you, Jake said firmly.
Sorry, I no understand.
It's all right, Jake growled, cursing their language barrier. You'll understand soon. I'll make sure of that.